Hello everyone, welcome to Multinational Business Management final lecture on a special topic, emerging market issues. This is Mia Ho. In the previous lecture, we talked about emerging markets and mainly our discussion focused on how traditional multinational enterprises explore emerging markets as a good destination for investments due to the cost advantages. And also we talked something about their drawbacks, that emerging markets often be perceived as high risk and volatile, with large variations across cultural, institutional, and economic developments while compared with the advanced one. In this lecture video, we will proceed our discussion on this, but with more focus on exploring the different international business strategies applied by the outsiders, that means the traditional multinational enterprises from the Western countries, and those by the insiders as well. That means emerging market multinational, the new giant businesses originating from emerging markets. And here are the questions we are going to explore today. The first one is that we're going to talk about what are the differences among advanced, developing, and emerging economies. What are different definitions of them? And secondly, what makes emerging market attractive for international businesses? And thirdly, what could be the risks of emerging markets and how to better manage them? And finally, we're going to talk about who are the emerging market multinational and how do they internationalize, especially what would be the strategies they have in response to the foreign competition. And to understand the definitions of emerging markets, it's crucial to identify different types of world economies. And as you can see on the slides, these are the keywords illustrating and describing three types of economies, including advanced, developing, and emerging markets. So your task now is to find your places in a column in the individual handouts. That would be the first question in your individual handouts, okay? Let's see if you got the correct answers. So basically, advanced economies are post-industrial countries with a high per capita income, highly competitive industries, and well-developed commercial infrastructures. Typically, the richest countries in the world would be the advanced economies, including Australia, Canada, Japan, the United States, and nations of the Western Europe. And on the other hand, developing economies are low-income countries characterized by limited industrialization and stagnant economies. So they were the poor countries such as Bangladesh, Bolivia, and Nigeria. And finally, what are the emerging markets? Emerging markets are formal developing economies that achieve substantial industrialization, modernization, and rapid economic growth. So typically, the BRIC countries are the emerging market. What are the BRIC countries? BRIC stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So if we take a wider perspective, we can see that emerging markets are countries which are in a transition phase from developing to advanced economies due to privatization, industrialization, and modernization. The emergence of emerging markets is rooted in their transformation from developing countries. In certain emerging markets that have evolved from centrally planned economies to liberalized markets, especially China and Russia, and also several countries in Eastern Europe. These countries were once socialist states but have been largely transformed into capitalism-based systems, partly via a process we call privatization, which refers to the transfer of state-owned industries to private concerns. Privatizations and the promotion of the new privately owned businesses have allowed the emerging markets to attract substantial FDI. These countries, they are quite ambitious to reach modernization in terms of improving infrastructure, increasing productivity, creating more jobs, and alleviating poverty issues. Therefore, countries which have started economic reform process aimed at resolving problems such as poverty, poor infrastructure, and overpopulation, and have achieved substantial growth in GDP per capita, and finally have increased integration in the global economy are truly be called emerging markets. But who are they? We know about the typical emerging markets, BRIC countries. What about the others? Well, these are various data sources identifying emerging markets, but they have different results as you can see from this table. So from the most stringent perspective, all the emerging markets discussed in this course are those have common census being approved by all databases shown on the slides. So therefore, you can easily identify that countries with 5XX are emerging markets for sure. These countries including Brazil, China, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Philippines, Russia, and Turkey. Now then, what about Taiwan? Where do you think that Taiwan should fit in these economics? This is the second question in your individual handouts. Well, within the categories of emerging markets, here is a key concept needed to be introduced. There is a group of economies that have described as the 4 quickly and highly industrialized countries, including Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. These countries, they are called Asian newly industrialized economies, and typically the 4 tigers we've been talking about. And strictly speaking, they have been developed and moved beyond emerging markets, but not yet as advanced economies. It is important to note that not a single country will always be categorized into specific economics. As the modern industrialization became more mature, current countries developing economies will move towards to emerging markets. And similarly, countries with emerging markets will move towards to advanced economics due to globalization of markets in international business contexts. Well, why emerging markets matter in a global economy? This table may give you some hints. This is clearly that emerging markets contributes to the world's largest population, accounting for over 60%, especially the countries like China and India. Due to such large population, their energy consumption reached half of the global consumption, and their combined GDP has remarkable performance. For instance, in the 1980s, the combined output of emerging markets accounted for about 36% of global GDP. They crossed the milestone in 2009, accounting for more than half of the total global GDP. While most emerging markets were disrupted by the global recession and financial crisis back in 2008, their average growth rates, especially the GDP growth rate, have remained strongly positive. Emerging markets have become important target market for a wide variety of products and services, and therefore attracting large numbers of FDI, exporting, and stock market capitalization from outside. During the global recession, technology companies such as Cisco, HP, and even Intel, they were generating a large and growing proportion of revenues from sales to emerging markets. Even for the firms in the global pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline, increased their emphasis on developing and marketing drugs in emerging markets. In fact, Merck and Pfizer, the 2 major pharmaceutical firms, have already launched popular drugs in India using innovative pricing strategies that make once expensive medication affordable for millions of low-income consumers. And also, businesses in emerging markets are important targets for machinery and equipment sales. In this category, markets are huge for textile machinery in India, for agricultural equipment in China, and for oil and gas exploration technology in Russia, for instance. Although emerging markets share these common grounds, they are heterogeneous in terms of their economic developments. And the video I'm going to show you is an interview with the JP Morgan analyst, and he will tell you why.
You think about emerging markets and you think emerging markets are going up, emerging market equities are going down, for instance. But if you actually look at the composition of emerging markets, they're very different. There's a lot of cross currents. There's a lot of countries that are represented with very different geopolitical issues and structures. There's very different economies as well as very different valuations. So for that reason, we shouldn't really think about emerging markets as one entity. You look at a country like China and you try to see what the composition of its economy is. And in essence, 51% of GDP, for instance, in China is actually driven by investment spending. Part of that reason is over the last 3 decades, China has been building out their infrastructure. Think about their ports, their roads, their energy infrastructure overall, and that's why you find that composition of their economy. You compare that versus a country like Brazil, in which 64% of their economy is driven by consumption, people buying goods and services. And also if you look at their investment spending, which is 19%, huge difference between that 51% in China and 19% in Brazil. Very similar story with Mexico, which has over 60% of their GDP is driven by consumption and much smaller part investment spending. Again, huge differences, therefore you shouldn't kind of think of all of it as one entity. When you look at emerging markets, there are different countries that are affected by different situations outside of that country. So you look at China slowing down and its effect on Brazil. A lot of that is because of their trade linkage. The biggest destination for Brazilian exports is actually China. Roughly 70% of those exports are commodities. So if China slows down, or actually just slows down their commodity intake, it could significantly affect the Brazilian economy. You look at another country like Mexico, this is part of the emerging markets, and actually their biggest trading partner is actually the United States. So if the United States continues to grow 1 to 3%, even though China is slowing down, Mexico could actually benefit from the United States growing versus Brazil not doing as well because of a China slowdown. When you think about long-term economic drivers of growth, demographics is one of the main ones. A younger population tends to increase the labor force participation of that country over time. So the more people that are working, the more that you get output of goods and services. So for instance, in Russia, the median age currently is 39 years old, versus in India, the median age is 26 years old. These two countries are part of what you consider the emerging markets, yet they have very different demographics and therefore over the long term might have different growth rates. So when you think about emerging markets and the composition of both equities and fixed income, you quickly realize that.
Okay, the rest of the video talk about financial markets. So if you're interested, you can continue watching by the YouTube channel. So in this video, the interviewee keeps emphasizing that there are huge differences among emerging markets, and as investors ourselves, we should not think all of them in one hand, meaning that there are indeed variation across the economic developments in emerging markets. Such heterogeneities usually triggers interests of researchers, practitioners alike, and we will discuss over these issues in the following slides. While given the heterogeneities of emerging markets, while increasing international businesses still see emerging markets as important locations to go abroad. In other words, what makes the emerging market attractive for international businesses? This is the second question, as you can see on the slide, and also the third question you need to answer in your individual handouts. So basically, there are 3 reasons can explain this phenomenal trend. Emerging markets as target markets, they are manufacturing bases, and they are very good sourcing destinations. So first of all, emerging markets, you know, that make up over 60% of the world population and over 40% of world's GDP on a purchasing power basis. Emerging markets have become important target market for a wide variety of products and services. Export to such countries account for 1/3 of total merchandise export from the United States. And this is because in many emerging markets have huge middle classes with significant income for buying electronics, cars, healthcare services, and countless other products. However, how can we assess the potential of emerging markets? There are 2 important indicators, as you can see on the slide. The one is the size of middle class, and the other is the purchasing power parity in each country, the so-called PPP statistics. And to understand the middle classes and its influence on emerging markets, I'm going to show you the video. Okay, this video essentially tells you the definition of middle class and why it is important to emerging markets.
Emerging markets middle class, the new consumer. There are several definitions of the middle class. The OECD defines the global middle class as those households with daily expenditures between $10 and $100 per person. The middle class around the world will grow from 1.8 billion today to 4.9 billion in 2030. The vast majority of these new 3 billion consumers will live in Asia and other rapid-growing markets. In China, the middle class is 12% of the population. By 2030, it could be up to 74% of the Chinese. Middle-class consumption. By 2030, demand from the global middle class could rise from 21 trillion to 56 trillion US dollars. 40% of this spending could take place in Asia and 60% in the Asia-Pacific region. The emerging middle consumers aspire for products and services catered to the upper income classes. As spending capacity grows, the share of expenditure consumed by food will fall, while the population will spend more on household appliances, cars, healthcare products, and education. Demand for particular goods and services will explode in emerging markets once income levels cross certain thresholds. Emerging markets are set to rebalance their economies toward rising internal consumption growth. What is the middle class today? How consumption trends shift from developed to developing economies due to their growing middle class? What needs to be done to sustain growth and the conditions of the growing middle class?
Okay, so what is middle class? How do we define which population can be categorized as a middle class? Well, in every country, the middle class represents the segment of people between wealthy and poor. That's the easiest definition, right? And they have economic independence and consume many discretionary items, as you can see in the video, including education, car, healthcare products, so on and so forth. In emerging markets, the size and growth rate of middle class serve as a signal of dynamic market economy. So for marketeers of products and services, emerging markets are truly prime prospects. Well, you can see the table here listing the rankings of middle classes, the emerging markets. India and Indonesia rank at very top, given their large population, but per capita GDP in these two countries is rather modest, especially when compared to South Korea, China, Russia, and Mexico. However, the percentage of income held by the middle classes in India and Indonesia is rather high, at 47% each, respectively. Contrast this to Brazil, where the middle class controls only about 39% of the national income. Demographic trends indicate that in the coming 2 decades, the proportion of middle-class households in emerging markets will become much bigger, acquiring enormous spending power. This is why many emerging markets have been perceived as a very good destination for investment for international businesses in order to explore market opportunities, especially when these international businesses they have stagnant sales in their home countries. Another statistic we call purchasing power parity, PPP, in each country. It is calculated by GDP statistics to estimate the real purchasing power in a given country. When PPP is high, it is obviously indicates that the purchasing power of a country is very strong. And one of the vivid examples is China. You can see the picture in the left-hand side, which was taken in LV Paris flagship. It is estimated around 80% of the consumers are Chinese at all times in the stores before the pandemic. I have been myself in Paris. I saw tons of people lying outside at LV stores, and mostly were Chinese for sure. When I finally got in the stores, I feel like I was not in Paris because people surrounding me were Chinese, and most staff in the store were Chinese as well. Another example is Japanese company called Sanrio. You've seen the video about this company in the previous lecture. You know that Sanrio is famous for Hello Kitty franchising. Very fond of Chinese markets and have great potential sales in China in recent years, because the company regards Chinese as having huge purchasing power. In addition to emerging markets as the target markets, Emerging markets, they are attractive for international businesses because they are very good manufacturing bases, mainly because of the cost advantages. They are home to low-wage, high-quality labor for manufacturing and assembly operations. Some emerging markets even have large reserves of raw materials and natural resources, such as South Africa for industrial diamonds, and Brazil as a center for bauxite, which is the main ingredient in aluminium. The pictures below are the Chinese plants. The left-hand side is Taiwanese firm Foxconn in China, and the other side picture is kind of the terrifying creepy door manufacturing of assembler in China as well. The final reason why emerging markets are very attractive for international businesses because they are very good sourcing destinations as well. Global sourcing helps companies obtain competitive advantages. Emerging markets have served as excellent platform for global sourcing. Numerous multinational enterprises they have established call centers in Eastern Europe, India, and Mexico. Firms in IT industry like Dell and IBM reap benefits from outsourcing certain technological functions to knowledge workers in India. Intel and Microsoft they have many of their programming activities performed in Bangalore, India, as you can see from the below picture. Given the recent rout of Indian labor towards a leading IT firm withdrawn from Taiwan, there is no excuse that India has been a popular outsourcing destination of IT services by foreign companies. I'll now show you the video about global sourcing in India, so you might be surprised that there are many business functions of high-tech and even professional services are now outsourced to India.
And this is a scan which has just come in. It's a CT of the abdomen and pelvis which has come for pain. We basically have around 30 minutes as our turnaround time to generate a report.
On a daily basis, we get two of these large air freight containers shipped from San Francisco to Bangalore. In this particular example, we have lots of old photos that are fading away.
Teleradiology and Scan Cafe service very different markets, but they are both examples of a new generation of fast-growing businesses bringing increasingly sophisticated outsourcing operations to India.
You know, in 2002 when we set up teleradiology, it was essentially unheard of. Everyone would go like, terror, what? You know, so it was a concept that was new. It hadn't been done. Doing it from India was, of course, unheard of because it wasn't even being done really in the US. It was just something that was so new.
The company now employs more than 50 radiologists in India and other countries, sending back scans to hospitals in the US, Europe and Singapore in as little as 30 minutes. And they're now looking to expand their services into less developed places, including Africa. Scan Cafe, meanwhile, was started out as a class project at the Wharton Business School. It began scanning and enhancing old photographs, but now increasingly employs high-end designers to create custom-made photo books. Originally, the founders planned to do this work in America.
And when we had the photo editing staff in San Francisco, it was costing us roughly $1 a photo just to enhance the colors and make it look nice and crisp. And very soon we realized that most consumers are not going to be able to afford paying $1 per photo just for photo enhancement. And the cost differential between the US and a city like Bangalore in India is almost 1:10 for a graphic editor kind of skill.
India's first generation of IT outsourcers pioneered the use of call centers and basic software development from cities like here in Bangalore. But now a new generation is rising in which ever more complicated services are being undertaken in cities like this. From smaller organizations doing medical research or graphic design to established giants like Infosys, who in their campus around me have 20,000 engineers delivering complicated software products, and even in areas like corporate R&D and financial services.
Behind the frosted glass here, I can't tell you who it is, we don't disclose names of our clients, is a team of over 20 AMBA analysts working on a performance reporting system for a global asset manager. While we originally started out just doing sell-side research support, Today we really support clients more at an overall front office level. And the reason this works, in some ways think of it as outsourcing 2.0, is that rather than middle office or back office transaction-oriented processes, we're actually taking knowledge processes that drive revenue and applying a combination of analytical talent from India, experienced professionals who've come back from the States or London or Singapore, and adding the rigor of what a traditional outsourcing professional brings in.
When offshoring was being seen as a cost advantage, clients probably would have decided what they wanted to do. So it was in a services model, it was predominantly build this system for me, or maintain this system for me, or test this system for me. Today it is slowly shifting to how is the technology changing, how is the business changing, what can I do with this technology in my business. So they're expecting more and more innovation and then implementing those ideas as solutions.
Infosys and Amber are moving up the value chain, offering their clients ever more advanced options for research and innovation. But oil giant Royal Dutch Shell has taken this one step further by completely shifting some of its research functions to India.
If we look, for example, at the bitumen activity, today this is the global center for research and development in bitumen technology, and it is activity that used to be done in France. Same is true for our polyurethane tech services, which was based in Belgium.
Some in the West are worried that white-collar jobs in areas like graphic design, medical research or financial services that were once protected from outsourcing are now being done more and more often here in India. But this is the second wave of this country's outsourcing revolution, and now it is only going to accelerate. James Crabtree, The Financial Times in Bangalore.
So from watching this video, you can understand that major benefits of global sourcing in India or other emerging markets is obviously cost efficiency and cost advantages, right? Different tax advantages of large wage gap between advanced economies and emerging markets. The strategic view of global sourcing suggests that just as the firm achieves gains in efficiency, productivity, quality, and revenues by leveraging offshore talents, it also obtains the means to turn around foreign businesses, speed up innovation, and restructure operations. Why? Because global sourcing allows the firm to free expensive analysts, engineers, and managers from routine tasks to spend more time researching, innovating, managing, and generally undertaking value-adding activities that contributes more productivity to increasing company performance. It is important to note that investment from abroad benefits emerging markets as well, because they lead to new jobs and production capacity, transfer of technology and knowledge, and linkages to the global marketplace. Well, given the perceived risks and challenges of emerging markets, why there are still many firms want to invest in emerging markets? Or more specifically, why it is more interesting to invest in emerging markets now than it used to be? To give you the answer, here is a video, which is essentially a UBS web commercial encouraging investment in emerging markets.
A lot of investment managers look at the world upside down, focusing on developed regions at the expense of those with greater potential for growth. The main reasons is that emerging markets historically have been associated with instability and lack of certainty regarding their development. However, today many of these economies are less volatile than the developed ones, enjoying lower levels of debt, moderate inflation, and better fiscal accounts. I'm Jorge Mariscal, the Regional Chief Investment Officer for Emerging Markets at UBS Wealth Management. Another reason investors tend to underweight emerging markets is because of a more general human tendency to invest in what is familiar. Now you can say this is rational to a degree because they're better informed about their domestic economy, more knowledgeable about local market conditions and so on. But this home bias, or instinct to favor the familiar over the unknown, can lead investors in the developed economies to miss out on growth and diversification opportunities elsewhere. When When I'm not working, I teach theory and practice of emerging financial markets. In my class, I show how most emerging economies have learned from past mistakes. And in doing so, I hope to impress upon the next generation of investors that provided you have sound advice, emerging markets offer excellent opportunities. This is in sharp contrast to the high levels of national debt in the industrialized world. In a world of anemic growth and low yields in the developed economies, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that in the future, emerging markets will be the growth markets.
A worldview you may want to discuss with your client advisor in your next investment health check.
Well, the interviewee in the video is UBS Wealth Management Regional CIO for emerging markets. In the video, he actually explained the reason why it is more interesting to invest in emerging markets now than it used to be. And the major reason for this is that historically, emerging markets may have been associated with instability and lack of uncertainty regarding developments. However, today, many emerging markets are actually less volatile than developed ones and have lower level of debts, moderate inflections, and better physical accounts. The reason investors based in developed economies tend to underweight emerging markets is due to the general human tendency to invest in what is familiar with them. This instinct may lead investors to miss out on growth opportunities elsewhere and to overvalue domestic assets over international ones. This phenomenon we call as the liability of foreigners in international business contexts. So we have known the opportunities and benefits of emerging markets and why they are so attractive for international businesses as a whole. However, what is the other side of the story? What are the risks or challenges in and of emerging markets? That would be the fourth question in your individual handouts. So let's review the answer in the slides. There are a number of challenges or risks of emerging markets. The first one is political instability. Obviously, political instability is associated with the corruption and weak legal frameworks that discourage inward investments and development of the reliable business environments. In Russia, for example, bureaucratic practices favor well-connected, homegrown firms. Western oil companies may be denied access to Russia's energy resources because in Russian context they have mafia, very similar to the Italian mafia as well. And the second one is weak intellectual property protection. Think about that. Even when they exist, those that safeguard intellectual property rights may not be enforced, or the judicial process may be painfully slow. In Argentina, enforcement of copyrights and recorded music, video, books, and computer software is very inconsistent. Cultivating the so-called unauthorized copying and production of the products or the fake product is very common in China, Indonesia, and Russia, especially of software. And the third challenge is regarding bureaucracy, red tape, and lack of transparency in their governments. Burdensome administrative rules and excessive requirements for licenses, approvals, and paperwork of delayed business activities. For instance, in China, getting a bank loan is very troublesome, especially for smaller firms. There are many government forms needed to be completed, and it can take several months to register collateral with the appropriate authorities. As a result, many firms can't obtain bank loans in a timely manner, delaying their ability to grow and flourish. While smaller businesses contribute about 60% of China's GDP, ironically, they account for only 15% of outstanding bank loans by their governments. And the next risk or challenges in emerging markets is concerned with the poor physical infrastructure. So high-quality roads, drainage systems, sewers, and electrical utilities are typically lacking in most of emerging markets, especially in India. Many still do not have access to toilets and sewage treatment systems. Poor sanitation results in thousands of Indian children dying every week. India's ports, roads, railway, and airports are insufficient to handle the massive volumes of cargoes that enter and leave the country every day. You have watched the video about India last week regarding its investment environment, where it's full of deficiency of physical infrastructure for sure. And the next challenges is the partner availability and qualifications. Foreign companies should seek alliances with well-qualified local companies in countries characterized by inadequate legal and political frameworks. Through such partners, foreign companies can access local market knowledge, establish suppliers and distribution network, and develop key government contacts. But alliances are just like marriages, Partners they can provide these advantages are not always readily available in emerging markets, especially for the smaller ones. So partner selection results in the risks and challenges while investing in emerging markets. That's the key issue here. And the final one is very specific to emerging markets solely. That would be the dominance of family conglomerates. So many emerging markets are dominated by large, highly diversified firms that are privately owned, referred as family conglomerates, the so-called FCs. They operate industry ranging from banking to construction to manufacturing, everything you can think of. They control the majority of the economic activities and employment in emerging markets like India, where they are called business houses. And in Latin America, they are called grupos. In Turkey, where they are called holding companies. In South Korea, where they are called chaebols. And the top 30 FCs account for nearly half of the economy's assets and industry revenues in South Korea. Samsung is perhaps the most famous Korean FC. Well, basically, FCs enjoys various competitive advantages in their home countries, such as the government protection and support, extensive networks in various industries, superior market knowledge, and access to capital. Here is a sampling of family FCs, family conglomerates FCs from various countries. Have you found any brand familiar? For local students here, you've probably found that a very particular familiar brand that is called Datong, right? Datong is the largest Taiwanese electronic and electrical appliance producer. The company was founded in 1918, so it's almost 100 years ago. And it started its international presence in United States and Singapore back in 1972, mainly through FDI in sales and distributions worldwide. And if you've been following local news here, you know about Datong has undergone several rounds of the ownership disputes. And if you're interested, of course, you look for information online. Well, I don't want to disclose too much information about this company and give comments on that, okay? And have you understood the competitive advantages and disadvantages of emerging markets, and what are the implications for international business while entering and operating in emerging markets? Well, here are a number of strategies suggested in a textbook. The first one is that successful firms should develop a deep understanding of the market by customizing offerings and even altering the business models to fit into unique emerging market needs. I think the sensible is that multinational enterprises, they usually can employ very creative approaches to promote their offerings for individual markets. And while suppliers and distribution channels are usually lacking in emerging markets, foreign companies can develop their own infrastructure to obtain requisite raw materials and components or more finished products to local buyers. And in this case, companies can set price appropriate for local conditions. So basically, the main idea is that if you want to invest in emerging market, you need to be fairly flexible to customize your offerings and business models. And sometimes you need to build your own supply chains, okay? For example, in China, you know that customers favor text messaging on mobile phones to keep communication costs very low. In India, General Electric subsidiaries GE Healthcare developed a super lightweight electrocardiogram machine that sells for just about $1,500. It is targeted to doctors and clinics in poor areas, and such low pricing strategy really works in some of the emerging markets. And secondly, the suggestion is about to partner with the family conglomerates. So typically, FCs can provide various advantages, including financing, bank services, local suppliers, and distribution channels. So by collaborating with the FC, the foreign companies can reduce the risks, time, and capital requirements of entering the markets, develop helpful relationship with governments and other key local players, target market opportunities more rapidly and effectively, overcome infrastructure-related hurdles because the FC usually already build their own infrastructure, and leverage FC's resources and local contacts, so on and so forth. For example, you know about Ford partnered with Kia in South Korea to introduce the Saber line of cars and benefited from Kia's strong distribution after-sales network. And the third suggestion is regarding to target governments. Okay, governments and state enterprises are very important customers for 3 reasons. First of all, governments buy enormous quantities of products, such as the computers and motor vehicles, and usually consume a lot of services, such as the agricultural and consulting services. And secondly, state enterprises in areas like railway, airlines, and banking buy goods and services from foreign companies, typically. And thirdly, the public sector influences the procurement activities of various private or semi-private components. For instance, in India, for example, the government works directly in planning housing projects, so Siemens, GE, Hitachi, and other major vendors regularly participate bidding for global tenders for emerging market governments. And the final suggestion is concerned with the skillfully challenging emerging market competitors. So instead of perceiving emerging markets FCs as the competitors, many foreign companies they can partner with them to overcome many of the challenges. But if you still cannot overcome the challenges, all you can do is to skillfully challenge them and try to understand their strategies and their local contexts. So new global challenges and other emerging market multinationals possess various advantages that require skillful strategies and due diligence to overcome. As a result, in the following slides, you will be directed to discuss the various issues of emerging market multinational. Especially, you need to understand that what would be the competitive strategies when they face the foreign competition from abroad, especially in the emerging market contexts. Well, in fact, what we have discussed so far was pretty much related to the outsider's perspective, that is, the perspective of international businesses which enter and operate in emerging markets. What has been missing in our discussion here is the insider perspective, which is emerging market multinationals. How do the firms from emerging markets become global giants, and what are their internationalization strategies? Well, this table illustrates the directions of global FDI, distinguishing the source from destination of FDI. And by specifying the source and destination of FDI, you can categorize multinational enterprises into 2 broad types, including the traditional Western multinational enterprises and emerging market multinationals. The Western multinational enterprises, the so-called AMNEs, are companies from developed world or advanced economies who seek international investments in other developed countries or in developing emerging economies. Whereas emerging market multinationals, so-called EMNEs, they are companies originating from developing emerging economies that invest abroad in either developed ones or in other developing emerging market economies. Accordingly, based on such dichotomous classifications, we can identify that there are 4 directions of global FDI, as you can see from cell 1 to cell 4 in the table. However, based on your point of view, which direction of global FDI presents the majority in the past? This is the 5th question in your individual handouts. So you can see the answers on the slide. The answer is cell 2. In fact, in the mid-1970s, more than 20% of global FDI flows went to developing emerging economies. And even to date, these economies present the main destinations of Western multinational enterprises, And also the second greatest global FDI locates in Cell 1. In the post-World War II, most of the world's FDI flew from one developed economies to another one. For instance, United States firms investing in Europe and European firms investing in the United States, mainly because of the similar investment environments. And Cell 3 indicates that in the early 1980s, 2/3 of our investments, FDI from developing emerging economies, went to other developing emerging economies. And Cell 4 indicates FDI originating in developing emerging economies destined to developed economies. These two directions only presents a reality which is a small percentage of global FDI flows, but they are arising trends in international business. In other words, there are more and more emerging market multinationals stand in the global economy by direct investments in either other emerging economies or in the developed world. This is therefore why, unlike the traditional view on Western multinational prices, which is the main course of international business studies you need to learn or you have learned so far, other than this, you have to learn the other side of the story, which is the international business strategies adopted by emerging market multinationals nowadays. And of course, you need to recognize who are emerging market multinationals in the first place. Well, as emerging markets open up the global economy in recent years, a number of local firms not only survived the battle for markets at home, they expanded internationally through exports and FDI to become giant multinational enterprises in their own rights. So you can see from the slides, there are a number of giant emerging market multinationals. Can you recognize them? These giant emerging market multinationals include companies such as China's Huawei in telecommunication equipment, India's Tata Consultancy Services in information technology services, Philippines' Jollibee in food chain, Mexico's Cemex in Cemex industry, a kind of construction material, and finally the Russian Gazprom in energy. The rise of emerging market multinationals have triggered a bulk of research on the relevant topics. Increasing studies in international business and strategy fields have been interested in questions like why those relatively poor and underdeveloped emerging markets are able to attract so many global firms in the past 2 decades. Are the dominant emerging market nationals, as you can see from the slide, distinctive in any way because they originated from emerging markets? Apart from the discussion of country of original locational factors in emerging markets, there is another string of IB research focusing on the strategic factors, and it mainly explores the question like, in what ways are emerging market multinationals different from traditional advanced multinationals? Why and how do emerging market multinationals internationalize in global markets? Remember that in the past lectures, when we talk about internationalization risks such as cultural, institutional, and economic variations across international markets, those concerns were mainly related to multinational enterprises from the advanced world. We often assume that these multinational enterprises from the advanced world, with relatively stable economic development and well-structured institutional framework in their home countries, will face greater challenges when they invest abroad in the emerging markets. What has been missing from the prior discussion is that we essentially overlook the importance of country of origin factors, or say home country factors, for those unconventional emerging market multinationals. Since they were from rather poor and undeveloped environments, will they face the same internationalization strategies as compared to traditional multinational enterprises from the advanced world? The answer is clearly no. In practice, many emerging market multinationals took very aggressive internationalization strategies to take the part in the global marketplace. For instance, in the early stage of their internationalization, they relocated their headquarters from emerging markets to the advanced world in order to offset the investment limitations in their home countries. HSBC moved its headquarters from Hong Kong to London, which gave the example for this kind of emerging market multinationals. To sum up, when analyzing the internationalization paths and plans of emerging market multinationals, we can't use the same logics to unpack their motivations and processes. To give you a better understanding of emerging market multinational, here is an interesting case, which is an Israeli-based company called Better Place. I don't know if any of you heard about this company, and this company was really ambitious and pioneering in the automotive industry. So let's watch the video first and see what would be the business model and business plan in terms of internationalization strategy of this company later.
We don't want to put an end to this, or this, or even this. We just want to end the world's dependency on this, because it causes this.
The increase in the cost of a barrel of oil dramatic.
Experts say the rising temperatures are proof of global warming.
Which is why we believe this.
We have to make the right moral decision. We have to make it immediately.
So we're making the world's first electric car network. It's made up of hundreds of battery switch stations, where you can switch this for this in less than 5 minutes. We call it Drive, Switch, Go. We're also building thousands of charge spots that look like this, so you can recharge at home, at work, or wherever else you stop. All this means you have all of this, everything you'd expect from this, and none of this. And no worries about this. The side effect? You help save this. This is Better Place.
Okay, you definitely have no idea that this commercial campaign was filmed more than 10 years ago, okay? But it still looks very new right now, right? So this company fairly tapped into a new market, which was electric cars. And the founder of the company did not have any experience in the automotive industry before. So what they did was bring in a new business model, providing and selling only services to the customers, which is similar to what we used to have in the telecommunication services industries. For instance, we pay monthly fee and we can purchase very cool phone for a cheaper price, but what we need to pay out is the contract, right, with the service provider, probably up to 2 years. And this is what we used to have in the telecommunication services industry. And the founder of the Better Place brought in the same concept into this company. This business model is separating the ownership of the cars and the battery proved to be very successful, not only in the home country of Israel, but also in the neighboring country in the Middle East. And the company was very ambitious to expand their businesses into the international market, especially European countries and United States. Well, the sad part is the company not disappear. They actually gone bankruptcy in 2013 due to liquidity issues. Instead of doing FDI in the foreign markets with full ownership and control over company's assets, Better Place was partnering with a local company in the foreign markets, and such business relationship did not work out very well for 2 reasons. The first reason is that their local partners in the foreign markets could not deliver the same quality of services for customers. And secondly, most importantly, the customers worldwide found the services provided by Better Place was quite limited. They could not choose a variety of cars. They can only choose restricted type of cars that actually had a partnership with the Better Place. And their electric charging station, that's the most important part, were not easily accessible. There were tons of problems of this company. So if you're interested, I already uploaded a case about this company onto the Google Classroom, so you can have a look on that. So this company, what I said earlier, was a really interesting one because they are really innovative. They are very ambitious as an emerging market multinational, and they proved to be very successful once in their internationalization path into the neighboring countries, but they failed in the other international markets such as United States, European countries. So taking Better Place, for example, what could be the key success factor of emerging market multinational in the global marketplace? Okay, so that's the another individual handout questions you need to fill in. Okay, so in other words, what sustained emerging market multinational, especially in terms of the global competitiveness? That will be the key issue we're going to explore in the following. Well, I just spoiled earlier that that innovation plays the key role in most of the emerging market multinationals, and that will be one of the key success factors of them. So though we do not often associate innovation with the emerging markets because many of their institutional framework are underdeveloped, think about China and Brazil, but many more firms in emerging markets, they are preparing to go down the same path in the future. Business magazines such as Business Week and Economies, they have noticed this trend with cover story on emerging market giants and illustrated the disruptive aspects of this emerging market multinational on the established traditional Western multinationals. But you may wonder that are these emerging market multinationals really understand innovation? Are they just imitating what has been done by its Western competitors? Well, according to a friend of mine, Professor Schenker in the United States, he has been doing a lot of research on innovation and imitation strategies and published many articles at Harvard Business Review, and this is one of them. He actually argued that imitation is much more important than innovation nowadays. As based on the empirical research, nearly 98% of the value of the innovation goes to imitators. That is, the imitators make the most profit out of the original ideas made by someone else. Does it bother you? So you have been always learning that company must obtain the first mover advantages in order to gain the market share. And it's always good and do no harm to be an innovator, right? But here comes the puzzle. Even if you were the first movers like White Castles or Diners Club, you can't sustain your growth if you do not keep innovating your new product and services, can you? Latecomers like McDonald's and Visa MasterCards, they are the imitators. They're really good at copying and making the original business models much better, so that they made down the majority of the market shares as well as the sales profits. And here is another example, especially in the smartphone industries. In the most recent data published in August 2018, Apple is no longer China's favorite phone manufacturer. It was beaten by Huawei, Oppo, and Vivo. If we apply such concept to explain emerging market multinational success, it does make sense a lot. Many emerging market multinationals typically lacking R&D capabilities and even do not have an R&D department in-house. What they have been doing to keep out the path in the global marketplace are either two ways. The first one is they usually apply very aggressive mergers acquisition, as we often see in the knowledge-intensive industries like pharmaceutical or high-tech industries. Secondly, they may purchase patents across different industries. So unlike the first approach, the most M&As happen to be in the same industry via vertical integration. Patent purchasing or transferring are usually across industry via vertical integration. Emerging market multinationals are particularly good at integrated functional knowledge instead of developing original knowledge. That's a key concept here. So let me give you another practical example. So I have a friend whose family business is the largest railway manufacturer in China. With no R&D department in-house, they've just made their first patent purchase last year to upgrade its railway infrastructure. They built a patent from a 3D laser company based in Belgium, which was a startup company, and the Chinese railway manufacturer applied its 3D laser technique to scan the trains passing by certain locations of the railway. With the instant scanning technique, they can easily spot the faulty problems of trains and report back to the end office of the railway company, ensuring that the problem will be fixed as soon as possible. So you see, this is an evolutionary technology in the railway industries to keep passengers safe, but this technique was not innovated by the Chinese company. It was actually imitated by the Chinese firm and even make it better utilizing a new industry such as railway and made out the majority of the market share and most profits. So in summary, innovation is always good, but what is more important is that imitation is no longer to be seen as a negative term. Any company that wants to grow and sustain its competitive advantages should embrace innovation and imitation at the same time. Imitating what has been done and make it better is essentially a type of incremental innovation, isn't it? Well, however, other than innovation, for instance, many of the homegrown emerging market multinationals find innovative ways to benefit from low-cost labor pools and overcome shortages in skilled talents. They usually turn globalization to their advantages, deploying the latest technologies by developing and buying them, such as the case of Huawei. They've done a lot of mergers and acquisitions to expand their global presence, and the one I just mentioned about my friend's case. And also, many Western multinational enterprises regard emerging markets as having relatively weak institutional framework and large cultural differences between their home countries and the target emerging markets. This produced difficulties for multinational enterprises to enter and operate in emerging markets for sure. But as emerging market multinationals themselves, their business model overcome these drawbacks and yield competitive advantages in the process, mainly because they have been familiar with their social and national environments in their home countries and do not perceive such weak institutional developments and cultural differences as a critical challenges for them. Furthermore, they go international as soon as possible to prevent regional rivals from challenging them. In other words, these emerging market multinationals, they are typical global challengers who are very ambitious to do internationalization, especially via mergers and acquisition. And unlike Western multinational enterprises, emerging market multinationals, they are not constrained by existing products or preconceived notion about the customer needs. They have been familiar with their home markets and therefore customize products and services to meet different customer requirements by localization strategies, and they initially go after the economies of scope. This can be seen from Better Place case that it produced customized products and services for their customers at home in order to firstly become the giants in its home market before going abroad. Then here comes the final question we're going to discuss in today's lecture video, that what can emerging market firms do in response to foreign competition? Okay, so unlike typical multinational enterprises strategies, emerging market multinationals use very different types of strategies to compete with the traditional Western multinationals. So here are 4 types of survival strategies of emerging market multinationals. The first one is called dodgers. So dodgers essentially means escapers. Sometimes companies in emerging market, they may not have sufficient advantage to be global. So if the pressure to globalize is high, especially in its industry, and the company's competitive advantages are very local, then the firm may have to sell out to multinational enterprises or maybe enter the joint venture, focusing on different areas within the value chain where local advantage can be utilized. The second strategy is called contenders, which is an contrasting case, where an industry is globalizing rapidly and the company's competitive advantages can be transferred abroad easily. Then the company can upgrade their capabilities and resources and compete with the Western multinational enterprises globally. Then these emerging market multinationals become the global contenders, also called global challengers. And the third type of strategy, we call it as extenders. So sometimes emerging market firms in the industry with relatively low pressures to globalize, they can still hold their competitive advantages, which can be transferred to similar markets, probably will be neighboring countries, and extend their global presence. And the final type of strategy, we call it as defenders. When the company is operating in an industry where the pressures to globalize is relatively low, and whereas the firm's competitive assets are customized for the home markets, they can still leverage their local advantage and focus on aspects where Western multinational prices are rather weak. Well, I'll just explain these 4 different types of emerging market multinational strategies in response to the foreign competition. Okay, please now take some time reviewing the case materials uploaded to the Google Classroom and answer the questions in your individual handouts. Well, once you finish, then I would say congratulations on the completion of this course in terms of lecture contents. I will review the answers for your individual handouts after the deadlines you submitted, okay? And I hope you have learned something from this course throughout the semester and gained the basic knowledge of international business management. This is a capstone in your program, and I hope you really learned something from me. And your final assignment in this course is international expansion projects. And this is a very good chance for you to apply what you've just learned from the course into the real practices. And I'm looking forward to seeing your reports and your presentation videos. Thank you for the participation in the course and hope you enjoy the learning experience.